Um, this morning's session is one that may transgress the time limit, so I may have to finish it in the next session, but that's part of time management. And last night for me was difficult because it was a new audience. You know, I'm not a preacher who travels around and speaks to 5,000 people at once. I teach classes where I know everybody's name and we interact, so I needed last night to get used to you and you to me. So I hope we'll have a good time again this morning. And I want to remind you that the book of Revelation teaches us how to think about God's world in God's terms. It's a very important perspective on what the book of Revelation is doing. It's not simply predicting what's going to happen in the future. It's teaching us how to understand the world in which we live, in particular how the early Christians had to learn to negotiate as Christians in a world dominated by the Roman Empire when they were a very small group of people on the Western Asia Minor. The other thing is it teaches us how to live in this world, not only how to think about this world, but how to live as followers of the Lamb. In the book of Revelation, the Lamb dominates, which is rather ironical to say the Lamb dominates, because the Lamb wins by losing and then being raised, which is a profound idea. And this is the paradigm for Christian living in the book of Revelation. And during the question and response time, I hope to be able to talk a little bit, I hope someone will ask the question, about how Christians can live in a way that contributes to society, because the book of Revelation doesn't think in those terms very, very clearly. So we can talk about that as well. But the book of Revelation is not designed to teach us to become speculators of who in the world corresponds to which figures in the book of Revelation. When we do that, we lose the Christian life perspective that the book is actually teaching, and we ruin the book's message. So I have to be critical of certain readings of the book of Revelation that are very popular in America and really big on TV, I understand, and these authors make a lot of money predicting of what will happen. But as I tell my students all the time, every one of those predictors has been wrong so far. At some point, we ought to change what we're doing. You know, it's sort of a human madness to think that if we keep trying, prediction will eventually get it right. Maybe we should quit predicting, and then we could learn to live in a different way. So it does tend to teach people the speculation that everything in the book of Revelation has nothing to do with us. It's for another period when Christians will be raptured out of that situation. And as a result, it teaches sort of an escapism understanding of Christianity, which is dangerous for our discipleship. So this morning I want to talk about Babylon and what we call in the book, Cody Matchett and I do, we call the Playbill. And so we're going to try to come to terms with a worldview that is taught in the book of Revelation. And this is the term that I wanted to use in the book frequently, but my editor told me I couldn't use it. And it's a theopolitical worldview. It's a divine politics. And he said, no one uses that expression, so don't use that expression. He said, we want to make this more accessible to people. The traditional reading, instead of a theopolitical worldview, teaches us we become scared. It's fear-inducing, and it leads to speculation and even to secret knowledge about what's actually going on in the world. And I'm quite convinced that John did not have that in mind. So today we want to look at a biblical worldview that will give us perspective on, say, Washington, D.C., Chicago, London, Berlin, Rome. It gives perspective on world-class cities and how their power is working and how the dragon can be at work in those powers and how the Lamb is challenging believers to live when they have those powers. And I want to give you a few tools for understanding the book of Revelation and its playbill of characters so that we can learn to think in the terms that John wants us to think. So the first term is that in the book of Revelation there are two teams. And Chris and I went to Hamilton, an amazing Broadway play. We went to the one in Chicago, and it's about the origins of the United States. It's pretty fun. And as I was looking at the Playbill, the magazine that we're given to watch it, I thought, well, I could do this for the book of Revelation. There's two characters and teams in the book of Revelation. So I'd like to go through the two teams, because the first tool is to understand the two teams that are at work in the book of Revelation. And then, before we get to our next point, I want to talk about the dangers of thinking like this. So it's not that simple. So the two teams. The first team we call Team Lamb. Who's on the Lamb's side? Sort of like who is on the Lord's side from Joshua. God and the Lamb and the seven spirits, which appears to be the book of Revelation's a way of talking about the Holy Spirit. The woman that we looked at from Revelation chapter 12 is on Team Lamb. The seven churches are on Team Lamb. There are allegiant witnesses, people who follow Jesus, who live in the way of the Lamb, who are true disciples, who are unafraid of testimony and testifying to Jesus in the midst of the empire. There are the four living things surrounding the throne. There are the 24 elders. There are angels. And all those who are destined for New Jerusalem are on Team Lamb. That's one team. Remember, Randy Harris made the statement, choose your team. That's a big part here. Now the Team Dragon, and this is how John operates. He operates with sort of a schematic world. There's Team Lamb and there's Team Dragon. The dragon, who is Satan. There are the two beasts, one from the sea, one from the land. I translate the term beast with wild things. The Greek word that is used, has been translated as beast, has the idea of wild things more than simply a beast. It's a wild thing living in it's an animal living in the wild world, in the wildernesses. They all inhabit a city called Babylon. And Babylon is propped up by kings, merchants, sailors, anyone who chooses to wear the mark of the wild thing. And John names some other names that have crept into the seven churches and impacted the seven churches. The Nicolaitans, Balaam, and Jezebel. These are the two teams in the book of Revelation. John has a captain for each team. The dragon is the captain for Team Dragon, and the Lamb is the captain for Team Lamb. These are the ruling agents who monitor and govern and inspire people on their teams. Each has a city then. Team Dragon dwells in Babylon. Team Lamb dwells in New Jerusalem. And they're beginning to live in New Jerusalem now. Now let me mention the dangers of thinking like this, because at times I think I have to push people to see that there are two teams. And other times there are people who really like the idea of two teams, and they become dangerous in the world as well with this language. So I see four dangers that can be at work in talking in terms like this. Some people would call this Manichaean rhetoric, and that is to see a dualistic world. We need to watch how we use this language. Sometimes it can become sectarian, that we are on Team Lamb, and we are the only ones on Team Lamb. I grew up Baptist. Please forgive me for that. And in my church, I I'm sorry about this, but it's true. We did not believe that anyone else were true Christians other than Baptists. In our town, there were lots of other churches, Catholics and Lutherans and Methodists, and there was a church right across the street from us, Church of the Redeemer, and there were Presbyterians, and there were Assembly of God. We had all the assortment of churches, but I grew up with the idea that we were the only Christians in the town, and if we met someone from another church, we just assumed they weren't believers. That's the danger of thinking that your tribe is the only tribe in the world. All right? Every denomination can get itself, every group of believers can get itself trapped in this kind of thinking. And the book of Revelation can kind of encourage that if you read about Team Lamb and you think that you and your church are the only ones who are truly faithful on Team Lamb. All right? The second one is that we can become hypercritical. The book of Revelation teaches us to be suspicious and even cynical of Babylon, which we'll talk about a little bit more this morning. It can teach us to be so suspicious that everything that happens, let's say in Rome or Washington, D.C. or Chicago, you become suspicious of. That's a serious danger. Not everything that happens in political governments is bad. Lots of good things happen in the political world. But the book of Revelation isn't worried about that sort of thing. It's trying to get the believers to realize that Team Dragon is at work in Babylon and causing problems for Team Lamb. And it was. And they experienced those problems. The third thing is it can lead to fatalism. As you read the book of Revelation, you realize that Team Dragon is going to lose and Team Lamb is going to win, and so we just sit back and wait for it to happen. That's not what the book of Revelation is trying to do to people. It is recognizing that there's going to be a victory. There's triumph in the way of the Lamb. But it doesn't mean that the believers can just hide out in their little bungalows in Western Asia Minor like Ephesus and wait for the end to come. Rather, they are called to be faithful witnesses in their world and to speak up and speak out and to suffer the consequences if that's what happens. And a final danger is violence. The book of Revelation has a lot of violence. And at times as you read it, you think, ooh, that's just a little too much. And I think we should feel like it's a little too much. And it can breed in people a belief that we can nuke them till they glow because we're on God's side. This is not healthy. War is always bad. But sometimes, for many people, it's not as bad as no war. All right? So there is this violence in the book of Revelation that I think we need to be sensitive to. I can tell you that my students, that when I taught college students for 17 years, they were bothered by some of the scenes in the book of Revelation. They were disturbing to them. And they thought, why does God act this way? I want to try to help us understand this in terms of fiction as we go along throughout today and then even in tomorrow. But I think we have to recognize that it can breed in some people a sort of legitimate violence and what the Germans call Schadenfreude, which is delight in someone else losing. And I don't believe Revelation wants that. They like the song of victory over evil, but I don't think that there is delight in the pain of other people. So, Team Lamb and Team Dragon. That's the first tool that I think we need to have in reading the book of Revelation. The second tool is to understand this word Babylon. So if you will listen to me, I want to read from Revelation 17, and as I emphasized last night, it's meant to be heard in order to stimulate imagination. So I'm going to read Revelation chapter 17. This is the revelation of a city called Babylon. It's clarified, but until this point, in the book of Revelation, you don't really hear about this city. And now that we hear about this city, we realize that the whole book has been about this problem of this city. So this is the problem of the book of Revelation revealed. One of the 7 angels who had 7 bowls came and said to me, "Come, I will show you the punishment of the great prostitute who sits by many waters. With her the kings of the earth committed adultery, and the inhabitants of the earth were intoxicated with the wine of her adulteries." This is the language of Old Testament prophets, where adultery and idolatry are so intermixed that adultery became the language for idolatry. Then the angels carried me away in the Spirit into a wilderness. There I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was covered with blasphemous names and had 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was dressed in purple and scarlet and was glittering with gold, precious stones, and pearls. She held a golden cup in her hand, filled with abominable things and the filth of her adulteries. The name written on her forehead was a mystery: Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes and of the abominations of the earth. I saw that the woman was drunk with the blood of God's holy people, the blood of those who bore testimony to Jesus. When I saw her, I was greatly astonished. Then the angel said to me, "Why are you astonished? I will explain to you the mystery of the woman and of the beast she rides, which has the 7 heads and the 10 horns. The beast which you saw once was, now is not, and yet will come up out of the abyss and go to its destruction. The inhabitants of the earth, whose names have not been written in the book of life from the creation of the world, will be astonished when they see the beast, because it once was, now is not, and yet will come." This calls for a mind with wisdom. And now John is going to take out all the mystery of who Babylon is. The 7 heads are 7 hills on which the Roman sits. And there is no one who didn't know what this meant in the first century. That's Rome. They are also 7 kings. This is the language that John will use for the emperors that the emperors did not like. They didn't want to be called Rex, king in Latin. But John knows they are kings and tyrants and imperialists. 5 have fallen. 1 is, the other has not yet come. But when he does come, he must remain for only a little while. The beast who once was and now is not is an 8th king. He belongs to the 7 and is going to his destruction. This is code language that John is using that people in the first century would have understood, or at least some of them would have, about the emperors and the change of emperors in the first century. The 10 horns you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received a kingdom, but who for 1 hour will receive authority as kings along with the beast. They have one purpose and will give their power and authority to the beast. They will wage war against the Lamb, but the Lamb will triumph over them because he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and with him will be his called, chosen, and faithful followers. Then the angel said to me, "The waters you saw where the prostitute sits are peoples, multitudes, nations, and languages." The beast, I want you to pay attention to that language, peoples, multitudes, nations, and languages. It's an interesting expression in the book of Revelation. The beast and the 10 horns you saw will hate the prostitute. They will bring her to ruin and leave her naked. They will eat her flesh and burn her with fire. For God has put into their hearts to accomplish his purpose by agreeing to hand over to the beast their royal authority until God's words are fulfilled. the woman you saw is the great city, again, Rome, that rules over the kings of the earth. Now, chapter 18 then describes the downfall of Babylon, the collapse of the city, and the rejoicing of all the people that were contributing to her because they had been exploited by Babylon, by Rome. And to understand the book of Revelation is to understand the significance of Babylon. So I'd like to talk a little bit about Babylon now to try to explain how this book works. As I said, Babylon is first century Rome. John clearly has Rome in mind. And Babylon is a woman. And Rome was connected to a woman in the first century, a goddess, Roma. And John is doing nothing less than subversion here. When all the Romans saw Roma as their goddess, John has the guts and the courage to stand up and say, in the empire, Roma is nothing but a whore. Well, that's the way to get your attention. He has just accused the goddess of Rome, adored by the Romans, the emperors, and the powers, to be nothing but a prostitute. And he's using this in very negative, scathing, scurrilous ways to get their attention. He subverts the goddess, the idolatries, and the powers of Rome. Because Babylon became for Jews and early Christians the most graphic image or metaphor or trope for a city filled with arrogance, sin, injustice, and oppression and idolatry, John chooses to turn the goddess Roma into Babylon in the book of Revelation. And every Jew knew the story of Babylon in the ancient world. So it's an insult to call the city of Rome Babylon for Jews and Christians. It's a big-time insult. It's a slur. If you wanted to insult for Jews a city, you called it Babylon. It's typical in their language. If you want to insult a leader today with the worst form of insult, you refer to him as a Hitler or a Stalin or a Mao Zedong. If you want to insult a minister of the gospel in our world, some of you are old enough to remember this, and for those of you who are, you get an extra blessing today. You call him Elmer Gantry. All right? And for those who don't know who Elmer Gantry is, ask the people who have gray hair, bald heads, or should have gray hair, but they've colored it. They will all tell you. If you want to insult an athlete today, you call him a Pete Rose. In the Jewish world of John, if you wanted to insult people, a woman, you called her Jezebel. And if you want to insult a man, you call him Balaam. This is what John does. He trades in labels. And if you want to go after an entire city, you pull out the Babylon card and say, this is Babylon. It's an insult. It takes courage to do this. This is the way to take your life in your own hands, which is why John is on the island of Patmos in exile, because he had the courage to lead Christians to stand up and tell the truth about Rome and the empire and Babylon. It should inspire us to have enough courage to tell the truth about corruption in political places and power places, whether it's national, international, local, or even in the church. And you may know a little bit about me and my daughter and my wife in the last 4 years. We chose to speak up against a pretty big church in Chicagoland named Willow Creek, and we wrote a book about it. We lived to write the book, and we haven't been put on Patmos for it yet, except for some people. In a metaphorical, we wrote a book called A Church Called Tove, which exposed some of the nightmarish things going on in Christian churches, especially in the United States. And we did not realize what we were getting into. And some days we've paid the price, and many days we're quite happy we've paid the price. But some days it's difficult. So Babylon is a slur. It is also related to Israel's history. In Israel's history, there was captivity in Egypt, and there was exile in Babylon. And these two places, Egypt and Babylon, become important images in the story of Israel. So when John calls Rome Babylon, he knows exactly what he's doing. And he's playing a very, very serious game of political commentary. He has become an opinion columnist in the Roman Gazette, and he has said the wrong thing to the wrong people, and he's paying for it. That's what it means to call Rome Babylon. When Rome captured the land of Israel, it became Babylon all over again in Jewish writings. There's a book called Sibylline Oracles that was popular in the Jewish world. It was an apocalyptic text. And listen to what these few lines say from Sibylline Oracles. When after the 4th year, a great star shines, which alone will destroy the whole earth, because of the honor which they first gave to Poseidon of the sea, a great star will come from heaven to the wondrous sea and will burn the deep sea, and Babylon, which in the book of Sibylline Oracles means Rome itself, and the land of Italy, because of which many holy, faithful Jews and a true people perished. So in the 1st century, we have parallel Jewish texts calling Rome Babylon. So John's language is recognized to his Jewish audience and to all the Jewish believers. And we know that Nero was one of the kings that Sibylline Oracles targeted, or one of the emperors. Now, this is where we move into our capacity as believers to begin to recognize the significance of John using the image of Babylon. Babylon in the Jewish world is a timeless trope, a timeless image or metaphor. There isn't one Babylon, there are many Babylons in the Jewish world. Any invading military that came in and invaded the people of God became Babylon in Jewish understanding. It's a trope or an image for an empire, for an oppressor of the people of God. Now, here's the implication of this. For Christians who read the book of Revelation, every century has its Babylons. Every country has its Babylons. Each state and each city has its Babylons. We live near Chicago. We got our Babylons. But the newest mayor is a believer in the church of one of my colleagues who teaches at Northern Seminary. So we got a little hope, but it's Chicago, so we have to live with it. Churches, Christian institutions, and churches all partake in Babylon. The dragon has the powers to release Babylon everywhere. That's what Revelation wants us to see. And it wants to give us eyes to discern the presence of Babylon and to see the dragon at work. One of America's prophets, William Stringfellow, a Quaker, said the moral pretenses of imperial Rome, the millennial claims of Nazism, remember what it was called? Das Dritte Reich, the third millennium, the third kingdom. The arrogance of Marxist dogma and the anxious insistence that America be number one, this was written in the 60s, among the nations are all versions of Babylon's idolatry. I believe that is someone who knows how to read the book of Revelation well. He sees Babylon and he calls us to recognize it. Babylon accompanies the church throughout the entire history of the church. So Babylon is not simply a first century church, and Babylon is not some first century city, not a church, sorry. Babylon is not simply a first century city, and it is not simply the prediction of some future city like Rome becoming the center of the Antichrist kingdom. Babylon travels with the church throughout all of history. It accompanies the entire history of the church, sucking it into its ways and seducing it to live according to the harlot of Babylon. Wherever the woman of Revelation 12 or wherever the woman of Revelation 18 is present, wherever the son of the woman is present, Babylon is angered, Babylon is trying to bring death, and the dragon lurks and uses wild things to do what it can do to the church. It can't be said enough. Babylon is timeless. So we glimpse the wild things in the Caesars in the history of the church, in Constantine, and even more in Theodosius I, in Charlemagne, in Napoleon, in Stalin, in Hitler, in Mussolini, in Churchill, in Roosevelt, in the apartheid creators of South Africa, and in the various powers at times, even in our own country. So, this is a load. To read the book of Revelation is to enter into the dynamic of Babylon at work in this timelessness, always trying to drag people through the powers of the dragon into the ways of the dragon. So Revelation, in that sense, is loaded, front-loaded and end-loaded with politics. It leads to the necessity of you and me having discerning powers to recognize the presence of Babylon in our world. Yes, this is negative, but people don't read the book of Revelation for comfort in many ways. I mean, you read it and you go, whoa, this is serious. And that's what it wants us to do. But it wants us to know that there will be victory. We are called to discern Babylons in our world. One of the great scholars of the book of Revelation in our world today is Richard Bauckham, and he made this amazing statement. Absolute power on earth is satanic in inspiration, destructive in its effects, and idolatrous in its claims to ultimate loyalty. Satanic in inspiration, destructive in its effects, and idolatrous in its claims to ultimate loyalty. Some of you have worked in environments where you saw someone got power and they wielded their power in destructive ways. Right? We see this. That's Babylon. That's what Bauckham is talking about here, is that power, when it's unchecked, will nearly always lead to corruption. And this is why, frankly, we have an American government that allows ordinary people to vote. Vote them out is the way you respond in the United States. In the first century, assassination was the way to deal with it. So Babylon is everywhere. Now, the third tool. The first tool is, how did I frame it? Is the two teams. The second tool is the term Babylon. And now the third tool is finding the marks of Babylon. And we have 13 minutes to go through what can't be done in 13 minutes. So at 10:30, we'll stop at some point, and then we'll have a break, and then we'll come back and finish. All right? I teach my students in classes on Revelation to read Revelation 17, 18, and 19, but especially chapter 17, and read it carefully, slowly, and figure out what are the marks, characteristics, attributes, whatever word you want to use, of Babylon. And over time, I have come to 7 marks along with my students, and I'm giving them credit right now, maybe more credit than they deserve. All right, but we've worked on these. And because Babylon is timeless, we can learn marks of Babylon that are a part of our world today by looking at the marks of Babylon in Revelation 17. This proves that the Bible is an ever-living word that continues to speak to us, even though it came to a group of people, but it's through that group of people that it speaks to us through the same Spirit. The first is that Babylon is anti-God. Anti-God. Yes, Romans believed in gods and goddesses, but the God of the Bible will brook no rivals and no other loyalty or allegiance. There is but one God. Jews and Christians believe there is one God. And so it is common in the Jewish world to criticize the pagan nations for their idolatries. In 17:2, when the book of Revelation talks about adulteries, they're talking about idolatry. In 17:3, there are blasphemous names on the heads. That's idolatry. In 17:4, there are abominable things and the filth of her adulteries. Adulteries, again, transcending sexual relations and moving into the world of idolatries. In verse 13, we read, they have one purpose, and they will give their power and authority to the beast. The beast becomes a political ruler who draws people's total allegiance and devotion and adoration. You may know about emperor worship in the first century. All the major cities eventually have statues and monuments and places to recognize the deity of Roman emperors. Several of the Roman emperors were considered to be deified at their death. And in chapter 18, verses 2 through 3, we read a very clear description of the adulteries and the idolatries of the first century. Babylon exists, one writer on Revelation said, wherever socio-political power coalesces with an entity that stands against the worship of God alone. Wherever an entity stands against the worship of God alone. When anyone calls us to total allegiance, we are looking into the face of the dragon. We're looking into the face of Babylon. And this is a characteristic of Babylon. It wants total allegiance. It wants our life. It wants our soul. It wants our body. It wants us to surrender ourselves to it. There is only one worthy of a Christian's allegiance, and it's the Lamb. And we surrender ourselves daily. We get baptized into Jesus Christ. We nourish ourselves on the bread and the wine as we recognize that He alone is the bread of life and who brings us as the vine, the one who gives us sustenance. This is our daily allegiance. In the book of Revelation, the believers are called and learn how to worship God. When you worship God, when Nero or Domitian are on the throne, you are doing acts of subversion, and we'll talk about this tomorrow. So the first characteristic of Babylon is that it is ultimately anti-God. The second is that it is characterized by opulence and luxury. Chapter 17, verse 4 says, the woman was dressed in purple, which is royalty, and scarlet, and was glittering with gold, precious stones, and pearls. She held a golden cup in her hand, filled with abominable things. This is a characteristic of Rome and Babylon, that it was characterized by opulence. In verse 7, we read, the woman, she has 7, oh, I got that one wrong. I don't know why I have that one. All right, verse 9. No, I got that one. Those are supposed to be anti-God ones, sorry. But and also when the merchants are bringing, they're talking about how they became rich by being connected to Rome. So Rome's opulence is characteristic of Babylon. Now here's something that we as Americans need to face. We are one of the richest countries in the world. And the Bible calls Christians to use their wealth for the good of others and for their families, of course, and to protection, etc. But we have more than almost anyone in the world. So we can learn from the opulence of Rome that we could be criticized the way John does. If John looked at our lifestyles today, when we are terribly upset when our iPhone won't turn on quickly enough, and we can't get to the internet site that we want, we are partaking in Babylon. Life is bigger than our little possessions. And when we see, you drive through cities in the United States, in the 80s and the 90s, houses suddenly went from 1,000 square feet and 2,000 square feet to 10,000 square feet. We see these homes in the Chicagoland area. I think the book of Revelation would say, watch yourself. Watch yourself. Are you using your resources for the spread of the gospel and for the way of the Lamb, or for self-consumption? All right, I'll stop there. I am an Anabaptist, so I don't mind having this kind of message present in our churches. I think we need to be reminded of this theme. So opulence is the second one. The third one is murderous. Rome was murderous. I've recently been reading Suetonius's Lives of the 12 Caesars, who was close enough to these Roman emperors to know people who knew people, or to know grandfathers who knew people. And he describes the Roman emperors, and I am absolutely stunned almost daily with the number of assassinations by Roman emperors. The way you dealt with political opponents was annihilating them, killing them, murdering them, poisoning them. Almost all the Roman emperors of the first century were assassinated. It's disgusting. But they did this with anyone who spoke up against the Roman Empire. And the early Christians were learning to speak about Jesus and claiming that he was Lord. When you say Jesus is Lord, and you say it often enough, people recognize that you're also saying Caesar is not. And that is subversive language. It is the language of a prophet critiquing the empire. Rome was murderous. The great Roman historian Adrian Goldsworthy said this: precision is impossible at this distance, but we can confidently state that over the centuries, millions died in the course of the wars fought by Rome. Millions more were enslaved, and still more would live under Roman rule, whether they liked it or not. The Romans were murderous imperialists. And this is the way of Rome, and the Christians knew it and faced it. When John wrote what he did, when John called Roma Babylon, when he called Roma the prostitute who sits on the 7 hills of Rome, John was speaking up and speaking out against the idolatries of the Roman Empire, and he saw it as Babylon, and he had the courage to speak against it. When he did this, he paid for it. He knew when he did this that he could pay for it. And he writes in the book of Revelation over and over that some of the people their robes will be dipped in blood because they will pay for it because of the word of their testimony. So these are 3 marks of the book of Revelation, and we will resume these when we come back after break. I think at 10:30 we're having our break. Is that right, Randy? So this will help us read the book of Revelation and put it together. All right? I got 5 minutes? I was looking at that clock at 10:20. It's wrong? I'll do one more. Okay. Rome was big on branding or image maintenance. If you lived in Ephesus, if you lived in Laodicea, if you lived in Sardis, if you lived in Pergamum, if you lived in Smyrna, today's Izmir, and you travel through in the first century, you would have seen constant reminders of the power and presence of Rome. Monuments, shrines, worship centers, architecture, colors, stories. You would have seen Rome everywhere. We see political presence in our country, and it's invisible to us. It wasn't invisible to first century Ephesians or first century Pergamites because it was recent for them. They knew when these things didn't exist. Rome constantly made reminders of the people that they were under their thumb. Roads, signs, military outposts. One of the most dramatic, noticeable features of the Roman Empire of branding and image was efficiency. Rome was the original IBM. It was efficient in everything it did. It turned everything into a mechanism and a process and protocols and an organization. There were idols everywhere and idols in every major home. Religion in the first century and Rome were inseparable. If you resisted the current religion on a holiday of some kind of sacrifice, you were not simply expressing your preference in religion, you were rebelling against Rome. And the early Christians were making these decisions every holiday when there were feasts and vacations that they could not participate in because of the idolatry. Caligula, one of the emperors, whose name means the little boot, who was an idiot. I think that's a nice word for Caligula. If I were with Lutherans, I could use stronger terms. He demanded of himself an image in the temple of Jerusalem. That's the ultimate form of idolatry and blasphemy to a Jew. Every Jew knows the story of Caligula. Every Jew recognizes Caligula in their cities when they see all these idols and branding and image maintenance by the Romans. Rome wanted people not only to be under their control, they wanted to remind them every day that every time they went to the city market, the Agora, they would see the presence of Rome in its efficiency, in its architecture, in its monument, and in its gods and goddesses on display. This is another mark of Babylon that John wants to draw attention to. Okay, all right, we want to continue with the 7 marks of Babylon as the third tool in learning to read and live out the book of Revelation. The 5th one is militarism. And in particular, I want to look at 1813. And the last expression, it's talking about the opulence, cargoes of gold and silver, everything. And at the end it says, and human beings sold as slaves. Rome would capture cities and areas in order to acquire more slaves. 250,000 slaves were sold every year in the Forum of Rome. Around their neck was a necklace with a sign that described with accuracy, meticulous accuracy in a Roman sense, all their attributes and weaknesses so that the purchaser would know who they were getting. Rome was a military machine that was designed to bring the goods and exploit other people's produce and resources and carry them off to Rome. Gallicus, a Caledonian or British chief, spoke one time of the Roman army and its ruthlessness, called them robbers of the world, and said, to robbery, slaughter, plunder, they give the deceitful name empire, and they call this Pax Romana. It's domination. Vespasian, closer to the time of the book of Revelation, captured Tiberias, and in Tiberias he slaughtered all kinds of people in front of the Jews, some thousands, and he sent out some 35,000 people for slavery. Jewish slaves were throughout modern-day Turkey, but especially in Western Asia Minor. So this is a foretaste of the violence that Titus breathes out on the city of Jerusalem in the battle with Rome, if you want to call it a battle, pretty tough battle, between 66 and 73 AD, when the Romans destroyed the city of Jerusalem, burning it, pulling down all the parts that they could. But if you go to Jerusalem today, you can still see the massive stones that held up the temple. I mean, I don't know exactly how long, but at least some of the stones were from the edge of this chair all the way to that chair, and they weighed thousands of tons that were carved out of rock a couple miles north of Jerusalem and carted to the city to become the foundation. And they're still there. If you go to Jerusalem today, you can see them. And when you see them, you're just going to be stunned by the size. But Titus destroyed the city. So Rome, the Jewish believers, Jews, Christians, all knew the story of what Rome had done to the city of Jerusalem when John writes the book of Revelation. And he knows that Rome is a military machine. A sixth characteristic of Babylon, a mark of Babylon, is that it was economically exploitative. The kings of earth committed adultery with her, and the merchants of the earth grew rich from her excessive luxuries. 18:3. 18:7. Give her as much torment and grief as the glory and luxury she gave herself. Verses 11 through 20 describe all that Rome was bringing to the city: cargoes of gold, silver, precious stones, and pearls, fine linen, purple, silk, and scarlet cloth, every sort of citron wood, and articles of every kind made of ivory, costly wood, bronze, iron, marble, cargoes of cinnamon and spice, of incense, myrrh and frankincense, of wine and olive oil, of fine flour and wheat, cattle and sheep, horses and carriage, and human beings sold as slaves. This is the daily experience of people outside of Rome knowing what Rome is doing to the resources of the empire. It is the daily experience of cargo, of wheeled carts going through the city of Rome every day, bringing goods from all over the empire, and they were not permitted to bring carts through the major cities, the inner circle of Rome, the Forum, during the daylight hours. And Jews lived along the Appian Way in the first century, and all night long, many times, cargo was going through on rickety, noisy carts as they transported goods and resources to various parts of the city. The final characteristic of Babylon is arrogance. This is an amazing statement in chapter 18, the second half of verse 7. In her heart, Babylon, the whore of Babylon, boasts, I sit enthroned as queen. I am not a widow. I will never mourn. This is the language of the Old Testament about Babylon. And it is here used by John to describe Babylon again as Rome. And it is a statement of arrogance. The text is from Isaiah chapter 47. So the characteristics of Babylon are domination. That word summarizes everything. They dominated the other cities and dominated people connected to Rome. It's about Rome, and eventually it's also about those who would betray Rome. And this is sort of the Rome in the narrative of Revelation getting her comeuppance. So these are the marks of Babylon, and I believe that all of these characteristics can become for us mirrors on ourselves, mirrors on our churches, mirrors on our nation as we begin to consider what Babylon is doing in our world as well.